Okay, so today we're talking about the sustainability special interest group, and I guess a good place to start would be just a sort of high level view of its sort of aims and objectives, what goes on basically.
Okay, so the group has got a mandate to deliver a best practice document, as all the SIGs do. It's a wide-ranging topic, as you say. We are looking at all sorts of things. We're looking at circularity with respect to hardware. We're looking at circularity with respect to heat and energy reuse. We're looking at, if we can get reliable data on it, the influence of software on data centres, and LCAs for buildings, so that's life cycle assessments for buildings, and anything that touches upon those topics. So we've got quite a wide range of people in the room, and we rely on expert insight on a specific area to develop thinking on that. So we've got a broad idea of where we're headed, but that may change as time goes on, as we get more expert insight into a particular area and think actually that warrants more exploration.
Okay, yeah. And in terms of, as you say, it's quite a broad area, so maybe we can drill down into some of the sort of parts you focus on and start maybe with material usage. I'm assuming that's what in the actual fabric of the building or the IT content. Can you give us a bit more detail?
Yes, it is in the fabric of the building, but the building itself is relatively simple and straightforward in terms of materials. Cement is not great for the environment, so you would want to make that building last as long as possible and look at ways of mitigating the effect. So that's one possible area, but we haven't explored that yet. What is more interesting is the hardware inside the building. So when you look at the servers for the IT load, you're looking at a lot of steel and a lot of aluminium, which is carbon costly to produce. Aluminium has a byproduct called red mud, which is a pH 14 material that there's no treatment for, so they have to put them in vats, and if the red mud escapes that vat, it causes a problem for the water supply. And then there are lots of rare earths and precious metals in the IT hardware as well. With current recycling technology, they are impossible to recover 100% of, and some of them are predicted to run out within decades. And in the mechanical and electrical material as well, you'll have a lot of materials that need careful consideration. We haven't done so yet, but we could get into packaging, for example, and the waste associated with producing the building. But I think the consensus amongst the group is that there's always been a focus on the actual building. So why don't we open the box on that and look inside and see what that building houses, and the machinery inside that delivers the function of a data center, which is more difficult but necessary, we believe.
Yeah, and in terms of maybe sticking with the sort of servers and the IT kit, I'm thinking, well, I know that, there's discussions about whether servers should be switched off when they're idle and all this kind of stuff. Are you planning to look at the sort of IT load in terms of minimizing, optimizing it? And even, I know it's a big area, but there's a vast amounts of data out there in this sort of digital world. Trying to understand and maybe even persuade people that data doesn't need to be kept, every bit of data doesn't need to be kept forever, but sort of life cycle management.
Yes, is the broad answer to that question. I would split that into two distinct areas. I'd talk about digital sobriety, which is why we use data, what we need to keep, whether we keep too much of it. We were speaking to somebody the other week who was talking about the energy cost of dead web pages that nobody looks at, or spam emails that nobody reads. They are costly to produce in terms of energy and material on the machinery that they're hosted on, and they serve no purpose. So that is one area that we are very interested in and would like to look at. The other side of it is the energy optimization of the hardware, and looking, we haven't got around to thinking about what happens if we turn machines off, but there are reliable answers out there on the influence of hardware on your energy usage and the way that you configure your hardware and how that affects energy usage. So TechBuyer, which is the company that I work for, ran a 2-year research project with Rabi Bashroush of the University of East London, looking at exactly that and developing a tool called Interact, which will measure the influence of different hardware choices on your energy load. And the tool's throwing up some very interesting information about how much of a difference it makes. I suppose long term, we would look at using that research and that expertise to inform the group and have it part of a wider discussion with people coming from different perspectives, giving their views on that, and then seeing if we can use pieces of research that have already been carried out and validated by the IEEE to generate a series of bullet points that are workable for the sector.
And I guess just a follow up to that, how much responsibility do you think the data center folks, owners, operators have? And clearly the IT kit belongs to, you know, various departments, you know, different functions, etc. You know, is it the data center's responsibility to push back at the IT folks to say, sort yourselves out, or should the IT folks be understanding that, you know, they've got a role to play in ensuring that their storage boxes, servers, etc., are as energy efficient as possible?
Well, good question. I'd say that part of it is the flavour of data centres. So some data centres will operate the IT hardware, and it is definitely their responsibility. For those that don't, I think that the data centre industry is in the privileged position of being able to find these answers out. If you don't know in your own field of expertise, you've got a forum in which you can find out. So should it be their responsibility to take on the emissions of the people who own the IT hardware? Probably not. But would it be a good thing for them to educate their customers in what some of the best choices are and some of the decision pathways they can go down? Then yes, I think that's in the interests of everybody. I think it's the interests of the industry, because it's going to come under fire as it grows, as data usage grows. We're already seeing things in the press where the data center industry is blamed for the entire cost of digitalisation, which is not true and not fair. But it's a nice reply to that. It's like, actually, no, this is not how it works, but we do know about this because we are interested parties in the sector. And these are the answers as we see them, and we invite more discussion and more understanding on this. So I think it's a good message for the industry to send. There's even good business reasons why you do that, like sustainability is, you know, companies who can demonstrate sustainable practice tend to be 30% more successful with customers, for example. And then you've got the investors, and then you've got a significant issue for the data center industry is attracting talent and attracting young talent. And if you can demonstrate that you're doing well in the sustainability sector, then you tend to do better attracting Generation Z, Generation Y, Generation X into your sector. So it helps compete in that way as well.
Okay, because yeah, one of the questions that I was going to ask was about that on the staff side. So sort of staff development and retention is, I know again, I think there's another special interest group that looks at the sort of workforce specifically, but what's the sustainability bit around that, I guess?
Well, Steve, who runs that group, comes to our meetings, and he does that so that he is aware of best practice that he can then use to inform his group. So that's kind of the idea behind it: developing best practice, developing education tools that can then be used in other groups and elsewhere in the sector. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and while we're talking about other groups, I know there's an energy efficiency group, because I spoke to John not so long ago, and clearly energy efficiency and sustainability overlap. So I guess, what do you get involved in the energy efficiency side of things outside of what John might do, or do you just sort of work together to decide who does what?
Well, the sustainability special interest group in its current form is quite young. So we were only on, I think we are having our 4th meeting this week. John is part of our group as well, again, for that cross information. I guess a high level description would be that we try and handle anything that's not handled by the energy efficiency group. So looking at carbon avoidance for towns and cities by reusing the heat from a data centre, which then cuts down on their electricity bills, would be one example. Or we've got members in the group who are energy specialists, so they would be looking at projects that load balance a renewable grid and how you join up your customers in order to do that. It's slightly outside of the remit of an actual data center, but it's still interesting, and it's still something that some data centers are doing as a social benefit, I guess, for wider communities and wider society. So we'd be looking at that as well. Yeah.
No, that's cool. In terms of the energy side, which you do look at, I'm thinking maybe energy at the point of use. Is that something that you do have a look at?
That's the crossover with the hardware, for example. How do you optimize your hardware to increase efficiency at the point of use? So yes, there are elements of overlap, as you say, in quite a large way. So you talk about one of our recent meetings was on scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions. So direct emissions, indirect emissions, and supply chain and downstream emissions associated with businesses and how they apply to the data center. Now, when you start getting into those discussions, then your hardware will cover scope 1, 2, and 3 in some cases. And so, yeah, you will start looking at how you optimize what you're using in the data center to deliver the best energy efficiency possible. And from a sustainability point of view, how you balance the savings that you make on embodied carbon, which is the energy that it takes to produce the equipment, with your use phase emissions, so electricity bill, and how, yeah, the traditional argument was obviously to refresh to the latest version of the IT hardware, but that's no longer true given CPU trends and the slowdown of Moore's law. But it's about how you calculate, how you balance those two. Yeah. And whether some organizations may choose to be more interested in the materials than they are solely in the carbon. They may be more interested in water usage effectiveness alongside the other kind of metrics. So it would touch upon it, but hopefully we can find synergies within that.
Mm-hmm. In terms of, you mentioned scope 1 and 2, sorry, 1, 2, and 3. That I'm thinking scope 3, maybe the industry, it's addressed some of the other issues, but maybe 3, the whole sort of supply chain is perhaps something of a new area for people. Is it growing in sort of importance again? Whether you reference shareholders, investors, all that kind of stuff, is that where the push has come from, or are companies genuinely interested to ensure that all their suppliers are helping solve the problem and not part of the problem that they don't know about?
I think a bit of both. I think certain large companies are very aware that they need to be addressing these issues. If you look at government policy, the government IT estate is going to ask for reporting on scope 1, 2, and 3, and it's going to ask its supply chain to report on scope 1, 2, and 3. So you're kind of getting pulled in that direction from your customers as well, and through any large listed company that wants to use your service and has to report on its own emissions. At the moment, it's only told to report on scope 1 and 2. But scope 3 is in the wings. And you asked why that was. So there are several reasons. One is that we are greening the grid, which is good. 2 is that data centers are interested in having an increased renewable energy supply, which means that their scope 2 emissions are reduced because they're not burning the carbon in the energy that they use in the same way. And 3 is that there is a growing awareness of the fact that this is not properly captured in industry, but is a significant issue. So if you look at the emissions gap report from the UN, for example, the UN, governments will report on their scope 1 and scope 2 emissions. And you think, well, scope 3 doesn't matter because that's a result of somebody else's scope 1 and scope 2. Until you realise that international shipping is not covered in this reporting. And when you look at the data centre industry and its supply chain, which is global, international shipping is a big chunk of that. And so if this industry is not taking that into account, then it's not capturing all of the information. And as I said before, I think that the industry is going to become increasingly pressurized to report on this and to demonstrate that it's doing as much as it possibly can to minimize the negative effects of data usage.
Okay, and you touched on, I think, renewables then. What does the group, clearly there are lots of views on the benefits of them, and you can buy renewable energy from your supplier, although it doesn't come down the line, looking green, it's, coming from the same place as everywhere. Without being too flippant, I mean, what renewable energy, what are you folks looking at, and what do you think the data center industry needs to do more, perhaps, than its initial engagement with renewables?
Well, we haven't had a meeting on this yet. And it's not, I mean, I'm an interested outsider, but it's not my field of expertise. So that's the caveat. My answer is that data centers are in a privileged position in that they're large energy consumers. So they could potentially be in a position where they're stimulating the growth of the renewables market if they set up agreements with renewable suppliers which guarantee the use of all their energy, for example, which then gives them funding to develop startups. I don't know a lot about the commercial agreements, but I have heard that that would be one option. And another option, if you're not large enough scale for that, is to group together to buy that renewable energy demand. So that's an opportunity, I think, for the sector. Again, I'm not an expert, but I understand that renewable energy supply has a challenge in that it's not a constant, for obvious reasons. You can't predict, well, you can predict when the sun's shining, but it relies on natural weather, a lot of it. And so you need some answers on how you can use your energy suppliers to balance that load. And again, I suppose with data centers being reasonably large customers, they could be in a position to make a difference and also demonstrate best practice for other businesses to do the same thing. So yes, but we'll find out more when we have the meetings, I guess.
Yeah, and I appreciate what you said, but just following up in terms of the actual, I mean, I know in some places, and again, it's largely geographical and or weather based, but people build solar power stations right next to a data center, or you can build a data center maybe not too far away from a hydro dam, as long as you're not, I guess, in the floodplain, because then that makes your data center not very resilient, secure, whatever. But do you think there might possibly be some move towards that kind of use of renewables, so you're actually, rather than just buying renewable energy that gets piped to you wherever you happen to be, data centers might get built in locations where renewables are available, sort of right on tap?
Yes, it would cut down on energy loss, wouldn't it? Because it's the distance traveled by energy that affects its efficiency. Yes, it would be an option, wouldn't it? I mean, I've heard of a data centre that built its site near a brownfield energy provider, which was already operating, and that increased energy efficiency for the data centre and kind of used something that was already there. So that would be another option as well, I guess. In abstract, I'm also interested in the material cost of renewable energy infrastructure, and what are, this is not a question for the data center sector, but I think it is a sustainability question. What are our best options in terms of what we build for materials usage? Because I talked about critical raw materials in the IT hardware, which we know about because it's our home ground. Those materials are also used in renewable energy supply, in the batteries, and in the coatings. And so I think there's possibly work to be done there more broadly, trying to understand what our most efficient option for renewable energy supply is, and then feeding that into decisions that people make. I suppose the other thing is that you have to think about the growth of edge data centers and smaller data centers, and how feasible is it to have small scale renewable supply next to them? Is that feasible? Is that a good idea? You know, how would that work? My feeling as a relatively newcomer to the industry is that it's in flux in a way. It's changing, and the lessons learned for these huge hyperscale models that have been developed and perfected over the years may have to be rethought now as the industry changes in terms of its delivery and its footprint. So I guess that's a fluid question. So it'd be interesting to hear what the experts have to say anyway. So thank you for the questions. I will put them to them.
And one more before we begin to wrap up. The circular economy, circular solutions, if that's a phrase, how does the data center, do you think, where is the data center on that sort of journey, or what importance does the circular economy have within the data center industry?
I think it has a huge importance within the data center industry just because of the amount of hardware that the data center industry consumes. So Gartner estimates that there are 121 million new servers put into production between 2019 and 2023. That's just servers, it's nothing else. And when you think that each one of those servers is, at a conservative estimate, roughly a metric ton of carbon equivalent in the production and manufacture. The data center hardware uses 23 of the 30 materials identified by the EU as in low or politically unstable supply, and that the treatment of those materials causes toxic byproducts, then you're looking at a large problem. And IT hardware, at least, and I hear the same at conferences about M&E equipment, is relatively hard wearing and doesn't degrade over time because, well, the fans do because they're moving, and the hard disk drives may do because they move, or the power supplies need changing out, but a lot of the equipment doesn't degrade. And so if there's a lot of this equipment running through the data center sector, and the data center sector needs to upgrade or reconfigure itself to develop new ways of treating data, I think internally it should look at repurposing what it has and rebuilding machines and reconfiguring machines as a first option, in the same way Google does. And then as a second option, look at cascading down that hardware to smaller suppliers. At the moment, the best figures on reuse within the data center sector, they estimate around 20%. Now the figure's possibly a lot higher than that because of the lack of data out there. And the lack of reliable information on what's reused and by who. But you're still looking at what looks like a massive waste. And I think that as the sector grows, it has a responsibility to demonstrate how you can put a circular economy in place in a large digital sector, which then gives manufacturing more confidence to do the same thing. Or other areas that are going to use data and digitalisation and hardware as part of that. Okay. I think there's an opportunity / responsibility of the sector to demonstrate how and why it works, so that we can have greater adoption of this elsewhere. And yeah, I think that's necessary given what we're looking at with materials.
And yeah, I think at the start you referenced that all of the groups have a sort of remit to produce some kind of best practice guide. Yours might be quite a substantial document, bearing in mind all the areas covered. But other than that, do you as a organisation contribute to other sort of industry metrics or initiatives to try and measure and produce some kind of standards around sustainability?
Yes. So members of the group do work on standards, for example, best practice standards for the EU. Members of the group have also been involved in the development of ISO standards around this. More broadly, a number of us are involved in the SEDASI project, which is the circular economy in the data center industry, which is led by London South Bank University. At the moment, that covers France, Germany, the Netherlands, and the UK, and looks at materials usage and decision-making tools for data center managers on optimal cost and environmental choices for hardware. When is the best time to reuse? When is the best time to send to refurbishment? When is the best time to recycle? How do you do that? What's the best practice there? So that's another piece of work that we do. Members of the group also speak to government on people like DEFRA and BASE on the best practice for ICT policy, both on the materials side and on the energy side. Yeah, and then we're also involved with an organisation called Free ICT Europe. That's through me, I'm a board member there. They look at lobbying government. Dogs here.
And yeah, I've
they
got
look
mine.
at lobbying the EU for things like the Eco-Design Directive. And they talk to the Australian government about right to repair legislation. Yeah. And I spoke to the Environmental Audit Committee last year on circular economy and e-waste as well. I don't know if you want to include that, because that's me rather than the group.
No, that's fine. And I mean, maybe in conclusion, I'd asked John the same question. I got a very long, detailed, interesting answer, but I have to ask, the environment, we all have our own views as to where we're headed, how quickly or otherwise. There's COP26 later this year, which a lot of people are sort of portraying as the final chance to reset environmental targets before it's too late. Are you a glass half empty or half full person when it comes to not particularly the challenges, because I think we all agree there are challenges, but whether we are going to get there in time, or whether our children and grandchildren learn to curse us because the world sort of is, will gradually melt away?
I think we all have to be optimistic is the answer, because if you're not optimistic, you give up. And that's the last thing that we can afford to do right now, is to give up. Yeah, you look at the numbers and they make you feel a bit sick. When you look at what we need to do in the time frame that we need to do it and what we've done already, there's a massive shortfall there. But there is a growing interest in it in all sectors of society, and a growing commitment towards it. And I believe that's genuine. I speak to people from all sorts of different backgrounds, and people are very proactive in doing what they can. So I think that there's a willingness to do it. And in this sector, at least, there's definitely a willingness to research what the best practice is. and what actions we can take now that will have the best effects, and then, you know, go for the big chunks first and then see what we can do about the rest later. So I think we have to be optimistic.
And just, do you think, because I mean, it struck me that the early environmental sort of gains were relatively painless and were a lot about efficiency, which obviously had a financial benefit for companies. We're getting to that stage now. Say, like, you know, I think, you know, the French government announced about, you know, banning short-haul internal flights if the train, you know, was, etc. We're beginning to get to this stage maybe when there are going to be some unpopular decisions made on our behalf, potentially about, you know, limiting whether it's air travel, you know, going on holiday abroad, whichever ones. Do you think we're getting towards that awkward situation where governments don't want to be unpopular, but they're potentially going to have to be? Or?
Well, possibly, but I mean, a lot of the world governments have also asked us to stay at home for the last year, and we've done it.
Yeah, but I guess there was
no,
a
what I'm
time
saying
limit.
is that people think that unless you have these measures put in place, people think that it's a lot to give up, and it has been a lot to give up. Lockdown has been very hard for a lot of people for all sorts of reasons, but there are certain elements in that have taught us that we can give up certain things. Yeah, I can understand why the French government would be looking at transport, because that represents roughly 43% of our emissions, at least at district level it does. So it's something that we have to attack, and we can't say, oh, you know, we can't rely on people to make the right choices, because making the right choices as an individual can be difficult, I guess, and also you don't know what choices to make. But I suppose if there's also a move towards demonstrating that there are alternatives and that there are benefits on those alternatives, then people will feel more positive about the changes. For example, you know, everybody moved to Zoom meetings. Yeah, there is, I think people would accept now that it's not a cure-all. We can't refuse to travel for the rest of our lives, because sometimes you do actually need to sit in a room with people for social reasons, and also because you get more done and it's a more productive meeting. But there are some meetings that we can have via video link, and we've demonstrated that over a period. We've demonstrated that it has you know, some effect, and that it can be very useful. And I suppose, given the lessons that we've learned recently, we can look at reorganizing the way that we do business and relate to each other in a certain sense. Some things, you know, are never going to work, like, you know, physio appointments. I heard somebody was doing online physio appointments for her back, and she said it's useless. I'm not surprised, because don't they need to manipulate your body and feel what was going on there? But, you know, there is a benefit in this call, for example. I mean, you know, the miles that we live apart, the two of us speaking here, the fact that we can turn on our computers and save those miles is a benefit, isn't it? So, yeah, that's a long-winded answer. I'm sorry.
No, that's great. I've enjoyed that, and I think some of the areas we've touched on today, we can maybe drill down to in, you know, subsequent interviews. But for now, Astrid, thanks very much indeed for your time. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you.